I stood in the basement archive of the State Health Department, surrounded by sealed records of a crime, with a man who represented the institutional power that had hidden the crime for 25 years. He was asking me to choose between the truth and the people I loved. He was asking me to accept that some horrors have to remain hidden because speaking about them costs too much. I thought about my mother, grieving for a child who was alive. I thought about Janet Reeves, carrying the knowledge of what she'd witnessed for 25 years. I thought about Andrea, who had helped me and was going to be destroyed because of it. I thought about a 7-year-old child in room 227 who had no name, who had become me, who had died so completely that there was no record of him ever existing. And I understood that I was about to make a choice that would change everything, a choice that couldn't be undone, a choice that was going to hurt people no matter what I decided. I reached for my phone, but I didn't hand it over. Instead, I opened the camera app and I photographed every document in front of me. The man didn't move at first. He seemed genuinely confused by the action, as if he'd already won the negotiation, and I was just prolonging an inevitable conclusion. Then he understood what I was doing, and he reached for my phone. I stepped backward. He was older and slower. I was faster. I moved toward the archive door, still photographing. The basement corridor was empty. I ran. Behind me, I heard him shouting for security. I made it to the stairs, and I took them 3 at a time. My phone was in my pocket. The photographs were stored in the cloud automatically, backed up to a server that no one in this building could touch. I'd set that up years ago, a habit from paranoid days I'd forgotten I had. I made it to the main floor and out through the front entrance. Security was moving toward me, but I was already in the parking lot. I got in my car. I drove. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go home. Home was the first place they would look. I drove for 3 hours. I parked in a shopping mall parking lot in a town I'd never been to before. I sat in my car, and I called my mother. "Michael, what's wrong? You never call during the day." "I need you to leave work," I said. "Right now. Tell them you're not feeling well. Go home and pack a bag. Just basics. Don't tell anyone where you're going." "Michael, you're scaring me. What happened?" "Something from 1996. Something that your ex, something that Thomas did. People in the government were involved. They're going to come after you because of me. You need to leave." There was silence on the line. Then, "Is this about that hospital visit? The one I couldn't remember?" "Yes, I remember now," she said quietly. "I've been remembering pieces of it all week. They told me you were dead. They showed me a certificate. And then Thomas came home, and he said it was a mistake. He said it was all a clerical error. He said you were fine. And I chose to believe him because the alternative didn't make sense." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But you need to go. Right now." "Where will you go?" "Away. Far away. I'll contact you when it's safe." I hung up before she could argue. Then I called Andrea. "I'm in trouble," I said. "Real trouble. And you're going to be implicated because you helped me. I need you to delete everything. Every email, every note, every access log related to the death certificates. Make it look like a system error. Make it disappear." "Michael, if you're asking me to..." "I'm not asking. I'm telling you what you need to do to survive this. They're going to come after you. You need to make sure there's nothing there when they do." She started to say something, but I hung up again. I couldn't listen to her objections. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I drove to a FedEx office and I printed out the photographs. I put them in an envelope and I addressed it to a journalist I'd met once at a county event, someone who'd written about government accountability. I included a letter explaining what had happened, what the program was, who was involved, what the sealed records contained. I included Janet Reeves's name and contact information. I included Patricia Voss's name and title. I included the hospital director's name from 1996. I included the date and time of the program, the location, the estimated number of children involved. I sent the envelope overnight mail. Then I sat in a coffee shop and I waited for them to come. They came in the form of 2 agents from the State Attorney General's office. They found me in the coffee shop because my credit card had been flagged when I used it at the FedEx. They were professional. They didn't arrest me. They asked me to come with them for questioning about an incident at the State Health Department archive. I went with them. I knew what was coming. I knew that my access to the county system would be reviewed. I knew that my search history would be examined. I knew that photographs of sealed records would be found on my phone. I knew that I would be charged with theft of restricted documents, unauthorized access to confidential files, possibly espionage against state institutions. What I also knew was that the envelope had been sent. What I also knew was that a journalist now had documentary evidence of a crime that had been hidden for 25 years. What I also knew was that I had made a choice, and the choice was going to cost me everything, and it was the only choice I could live with. The questioning went for 6 hours. They showed me the photographs. They asked me how I'd obtained them. They asked me why I'd sent them to a journalist. They asked me if I understood the seriousness of what I'd done. I understood completely. I want a lawyer, I said, and I want to make a statement. I want to tell you everything about the psychiatric program at County Hospital in 1996, and I want every word recorded. The lawyer arrived the next morning. The statement took 4 hours. I told them about the death certificate with my name. I told them about Janet Reeves and the sealed records. I told them about Patricia Voss and the phone call. I told them about the man in the basement who'd threatened my family. I told them about the child in room 227 who had become me in the system and then disappeared. And then I told them about the other death certificates, the 15 other ones that Janet had mentioned, the ones that used different names, but that all referenced the same patient ID system. The ones that documented children who had been removed from the program and then erased from existence. 3 days later, federal investigators seized the State Health Department's records. 3 weeks later, Patricia Voss was arrested. The hospital director from 1996 had died in 1998, but his estate was investigated. My father, Thomas Hendricks, had died in 2001, which explained where he'd disappeared to. But his involvement in the program was documented, and his name was listed in every official finding. The journalist published the story. It took up the entire front page of the Sunday paper. Hidden program. State experimented on psychiatric patients. The article detailed the program, the children involved, the deaths, the cover-up. It named names. It showed documents. It asked questions about how many other programs like this had existed, how many other children had been disappeared and replaced with false identities. I was charged with theft of restricted documents and unauthorized access to state systems. My lawyer negotiated a deal. I would cooperate fully with investigators. I would testify. In exchange, the charges would be reduced to misdemeanors. I would serve no time in prison. But I lost my job. The County Records Department terminated my employment, citing the breach of confidentiality. I couldn't work in any county institution again. I couldn't work in any position requiring access to confidential records. My mother survived. She moved to a small town in Missouri and got a job at a library. She called me once a week. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't talk about Thomas, or the hospital, or the program. We just talked about ordinary things. Whether it was cold where she was, whether my legal situation had changed, whether I was eating enough. Janet Reeves testified at Patricia Voss's trial. Her testimony was devastating. She described the program in detail. She described the medications given to children. She described the procedures. She described the children who had complications. She described watching the institution cover up what had happened. After the trial, Janet's career was effectively over. No hospital would hire her. No medical facility would employ her. She opened a small consulting business, helping families navigate healthcare systems. It wasn't much, but it was something. Andrea kept her job. I don't know if she actually deleted the files or if she just cooperated with investigators when they asked her questions. We never discussed it. I saw her once, 6 months after everything, in the grocery store. She looked tired. She looked at me from across the produce section, and then she turned and walked to a different aisle. I understood. I had destroyed her professional credibility, even if I hadn't meant to. I had exposed her to consequences because I needed help, and she had given it. That was something I carried. The knowledge that my choices had damaged people who hadn't done anything wrong, except care about the truth. I took a job at a printing company, designing layouts and managing client relationships. It was different from records work, but it was work. It was ordinary, and it didn't require access to sealed documents or state systems. It was the kind of job where I could be anonymous and unremarkable. The one thing I never forgot was the feeling of that moment in the basement archive when the man asked me to choose between truth and family. When he told me that some horrors have to remain hidden because the cost of speaking them is too high. He was right that the cost was high, but he was wrong that it was too high to pay. A 7-year-old child had died in a hospital and been erased from existence. His body had been replaced with my identity. His name had been written over in permanent marker. His death had been sealed by the state. The only thing that had changed that was someone willing to speak it out loud, no matter what it cost. I was that someone. And every day of my ordinary new life, I understood that I would always be the person who had broken the silence, who had chosen truth over protection, who had decided that the people I loved would be safer in a world where the crime was exposed than in a world where it was hidden. I don't know if that was the right choice. I live with the suspicion that it might not have been, but I live with it openly, and that matters. I couldn't go back to the coffee shop after the man in the basement let me leave, and he did let me leave, which I've never fully understood. I spent the rest of Monday walking through downtown Indianapolis. My phone was in my pocket. I didn't check it. I didn't call anyone. I just walked and tried to understand what had happened. By evening, I was back in my apartment. The door was locked. Nothing seemed disturbed. I sat on my couch in the dark for an hour before I turned on any lights. Janet had given me her phone number in the coffee shop. She'd written it on a napkin. I looked at the napkin now, sitting on my kitchen counter, and I tried to decide if calling her would make anything better or worse. She'd already betrayed me by talking, or she'd helped me by talking. I couldn't figure out which one it was. Instead, I opened my laptop, and I did something I should have done immediately. I searched for the names Patricia Voss and Thomas Hendricks together. I was looking for anything that would connect my father to the state health department official. Some conference record, some meeting, some institutional paper trail. Nothing came up. No shared publications, no joint presentations, no grant applications listing both names. It was like they'd been careful never to appear together in any official capacity. But I found Patricia Voss's biography on the State Health Department website. She'd been employed there since 1992. Her specialization was psychiatric care policy. She had a master's degree in public health. She'd been involved in several significant research initiatives that advanced understanding of mental health treatment protocols. The phrase, significant research initiatives, sat with me. Janet had called it a program. The man in the basement had called it research. but the death certificate had called it nothing. It was just a death. Just a child in a hospital who had died. I pulled up the 1996 newspaper article again. The state inspection. The article was from November 17th. The inspection was conducted on November 15th. The hospital had been cited for code violations. The inspection findings were restricted. The hospital remained in good standing. 3 days between the inspection and the filing of the death certificate. 3 days for whatever had happened in room 227 to be converted into a single form that said I was dead. I searched for County Hospital Psychiatric Unit 1996. I found an archived article from 1998 announcing the closure of the sub-basement psychiatric ward. The article said the facility had been closed due to renovations. It said new psychiatric services would be offered through a partnership with a private mental health provider. It didn't mention the state inspection. It didn't mention why the renovation was necessary. I searched for the private mental health provider. They'd gone out of business in 2003. Their facility had been demolished in 2005. Everything connected to the program was being systematically erased. Not erased. That would imply a sudden, coordinated effort. Dissolved. Closed gently. Renovated. Transferred. Discontinued. The kind of institutional language that made something invisible while keeping it technically documented. I called Andrea the next morning. "Don't call me," she said immediately. "We can't talk about this. Not by phone, not in person, not ever. I need to know if you found anything else, any other anomalies in the system, any other records that don't match. Michael, I'm begging you. Stop. Leave this alone. Go back to work. Do your job. Pretend this never happened." "Did you find anything?" I said. There was a long silence. Then, "Yes, but I'm not telling you what it is, and you're not going to investigate it. You're going to let it go." She hung up. I went to work Wednesday as if nothing had happened. Andrea didn't make eye contact with me. The other staff members treated me normally, which meant they hadn't been told anything yet. My supervisor was in a meeting all morning. At lunch, I accessed the county death certificate database from my work terminal. I pulled up the 1996 certificate again. Same information. Same redacted notification box. Same illegible physician's signature. But this time, I looked at the processing notes, the internal comments that the filing clerk would have added when the document came in. There was a single note from November 16th, 1996, flagged for review per instruction, approved for filing same day. Flagged for review per instruction. Someone had specifically asked the filing clerk to review this particular death certificate. Someone had authority over the filing clerk. Someone had said, "This certificate needs to be reviewed," and then approved, and then filed. I searched the system for any other certificates from November 1996 that had the same processing note. There were 4. 4 death certificates filed in November 1996, all flagged for review per instruction, all approved for filing on the same day they were submitted. 2 of them were for elderly patients, normal deaths. But the other 2 were for children. One was 3 years old. One was 9 years old. Neither of them had my name. I photographed the screen with my phone. Not a careful photograph. Just a quick snapshot of the processing notes for both certificates. Then I erased my search history. Not from my computer. I knew that wouldn't really erase anything. Just from my conscious awareness. I closed the database. I went back to my regular work. I pretended I had never seen those notes. But I knew now that whatever had happened in room 227 had happened to at least 4 children. Maybe more. Maybe the ones I'd found were just the ones that had been flagged, which meant someone had wanted them reviewed, which meant someone had been paying attention, which meant someone had suspected something was wrong. That evening, I called Janet again. "The 4 certificates," I said. "The ones flagged for review. Were those the children who died? Or were those the ones who were transferred?" "I can't talk to you," Janet said. "Were they children who died? Or children who were transferred?" "If I tell you, I'm putting myself at risk. And I'm putting you at more risk than you're already in. I need to know. 2 died. 2 were transferred. That's all I'm going to say. Don't call me again." She hung up. 2 died, and 2 were transferred. That meant the transfer wasn't a routine medical thing. Transfers could be positive, moving someone to a better facility. But in the context of what was happening in room 227, in the context of an inspection that shut down the entire unit, a transfer looked different. A transfer looked like moving evidence. I spent Thursday trying to find records of where the 2 transferred children had gone. I had access to interstate hospital transfer databases through the county system. It was one of those tools that most people didn't know existed, but that someone in records could access if they had the credentials and if they knew the right searches. I found 1 transfer, a 7-year-old admitted to a residential psychiatric facility in Kentucky on November 16, 1996. The admission paperwork showed a referral from County Hospital. The child's name was Robert Malone. His intake assessment noted severe behavioral dysregulation, secondary to medication reactions. I searched for Robert Malone's current status in the Kentucky system. The record ended in 2002. The notation said, "Discharged to independent living." There was no follow-up address, no current whereabouts, just a discharge date and then nothing. I couldn't find the second transferred child. No name, no facility, no record. It was as if the second transfer had been arranged outside the official system. A phone call, a handshake, a cash payment to someone willing to take a child and ask no questions. I left work early Friday. My supervisor asked if I was feeling okay. I said I had a migraine. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had a kind of pain that was centered behind my eyes, a tension that had been building since Tuesday, and that no amount of aspirin could touch. I drove to the public library, and I used one of their computers. I searched for news articles about psychiatric programs in Indiana during the 1990s. I was looking for anything that mentioned experimentation, research, medication protocols, children, adverse reactions. Most of what came up was standard medical progress, articles about new treatments, new medications, new understanding of psychiatric illness. But there was one article from 1994 in an academic journal that caught my attention. It was about genetic markers for psychiatric illness and how early identification could lead to better treatment outcomes. The article was published in the journal Biological Psychiatry. The authors were listed as Dr. Patricia Voss, Dr. Richard Massey, and Thomas Hendricks. My father had written an academic article about identifying psychiatric illness in children. I printed the article. My hands were shaking as I waited for the printer. The abstract explained the study. They'd been looking at genetic predisposition for psychiatric conditions in children ages 5 to 12. They'd been using behavioral observation and biological markers, blood tests, neurological assessments. They'd been looking at family history. They'd been trying to create a predictive model for which children would develop serious psychiatric illness later in life. The study population was 47 children. The method was described clinically, without acknowledging that any of the children might have suffered complications. The conclusion stated that early identification of at-risk individuals shows promise for preventive intervention strategies. 47 children. I had found records of 4 flagged for review. I had found Janet's mention of 37 in the program. None of these numbers matched. Either there were children I hadn't found, or the numbers weren't accurate. or the program had existed in multiple locations. I sat in the library and I read the article 3 times. The more I read it, the more horrified I became, because it was written in the language of legitimate science. It was peer-reviewed. It was published in a real journal. It was the kind of thing a doctor or a researcher could point to and say, this was important work. This mattered. The fact that some children had complications was regrettable, but the knowledge gained was valuable, and that was how a crime could become invisible. Not by being hidden, by being published, by being legitimized, by being turned into research that other researchers could cite. My father's name was in an academic database somewhere. Someone could find that article. Someone could read it and think, this was important work. I checked out a copy of the journal on microfiche. The librarian seemed surprised that anyone still used the microfiche system, but she scanned it for me anyway. I took the printout home. Saturday morning, I called my mother. Did you know about the research program? I asked. What program? The psychiatric research, the one at County Hospital. Did Thomas ever talk about it? There was silence on the line. Then my mother said, he mentioned a study. He said he was consulting with the hospital on child psychiatric assessment. He said it was important work. He said it was going to help children. Did he mention what the study involved? Did he mention what they were doing to the children? No. I asked him about it once, and he said it was confidential. He said I shouldn't ask questions about his work. Did you ever meet any of the children? No. Michael, where is this coming from? Why are you asking about this now? Because I think I might have been in that study, I said. Another silence. A longer one. Then, no. No, you weren't. You were never sick. You were never hospitalized. There's a death certificate for someone with my name, filed in November 1996. The certificate says I died in County Hospital, in the psychiatric unit, in room 227. I heard my mother's breath catch. That's not possible. It's in the county system. It exists. Michael, if that were true, someone would have told me. The hospital would have told me. Thomas would have... She stopped. What would Thomas have done? I said. He disappeared, my mother said quietly. That's why I never talk about him. That's why I told you he just left and never came back. He disappeared in 1996, and I never knew why. And I chose not to look too hard, because I was afraid of what I would find. That was the moment when I understood that my mother had always known something was wrong. She had always known that Thomas's disappearance wasn't a normal abandonment. She had chosen to construct a story that made sense. He was a selfish man. He left his family. He never looked back. But she had known it was incomplete. She had known there was something underneath it that she didn't want to examine. I need to find out what happened to the child who died, I said. The child whose death they used my name for. I need to know his real name. Michael, please don't. Please just leave this alone. I can't. Then you're going to destroy yourself, and you're going to destroy me by association. She was right. I knew she was right, but I couldn't stop. I spent Sunday doing something I'd been avoiding. I went back through the county system, and I pulled every death certificate filed between November 1994 and November 1997. I was looking for a pattern. Children who died during the window when the program was operating. Children whose certificates had the same kinds of irregularities as mine. I found 11 children, ages 3 to 12, all filed during that 3-year window. 8 of them had been filed from County Hospital. 3 had been filed from other facilities, but all 3 of those had referral notations connecting them back to County Hospital. 4 of the certificates had illegible physician signatures. 7 of them had redacted or incomplete notification boxes. 2 of them, including mine, had the handwritten processing note about being flagged for review. I printed them all. I laid them out on my kitchen table in chronological order. 11 children. 11 deaths that might not have been real deaths. 11 identities that might have been used to cover something up. But here was the thing that changed everything. One of the certificates had a name I recognized. The certificate was filed October 3rd, 1996. The child was listed as Daniel Marcus Hendricks, age 5. Cause of death, acute respiratory failure. Location, County Hospital. Daniel Marcus Hendricks. My father's name was Thomas David Hendricks. A child named Daniel Marcus Hendricks had died in the same hospital 2 months before my supposed death. Daniel Marcus could have been a cousin, a distant relative, a complete coincidence. Or Daniel Marcus could have been my father's child, a child from a relationship before my mother, a child who had been admitted to the psychiatric program and who had actually died there. I called my mother again. "Did Thomas have any other children?" I asked. "Before you? Before me?" "I don't know. Michael, I don't want to talk about this anymore." "Did he have a son? Someone named Daniel?" My mother didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear her breathing, could hear the sound of her thinking whether to lie or tell the truth. "There was someone," she said finally. "Thomas mentioned it once. He said he had a child from a previous relationship. He said the mother had custody. He said it was complicated. That's all I ever knew about it." "What was the child's name?" "I don't remember. Michael, this was 30 years ago, and I chose not to ask questions. I chose to focus on my own life, on you, on not thinking about Thomas's past." "Did he ever mention what happened to that child?" "No." I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by 11 death certificates, and I understood something that made me feel physically sick. My father might have deliberately placed his own child in an experimental program. My father might have authorized researchers to conduct experiments on his own son. And when something went wrong, when the child had a complication, when the child died, my father had helped cover it up by using another child's identity. My identity. But that didn't make logical sense. If my father had done something to his own child, why would he then risk his other child by involving me in the cover-up? Why would he use my identity to hide the death? That would only create a connection between me and the program. That would only ensure that if anyone ever looked, they would find me implicated. Unless that was the point. Unless using my identity wasn't about protection. Unless it was about something else entirely. I searched the State Health Department website again, this time looking for information about grant funding. The program would have needed money. Money came from somewhere. I found the grants database. I searched for grants related to psychiatric research between 1994 and 1997. I found it. A grant to County Hospital from the National Institute of Mental Health. Principal investigator, Dr. Richard Massey. Co-investigators, Patricia Voss, Thomas Hendricks. Grant amount, $847,000. Grant period, 1994 to 1998. $847,000 to research psychiatric identification in children. $847,000 that had been approved by the federal government. $847,000 that had funded a program where children had died or been disappeared. I called the number for the National Institute of Mental Health. I got a recorded message directing me to their website. I found the grants database and I searched for the grant number I'd written down. The grant was listed as completed in 1998. The final report was marked as filed, but there was no link to the report itself. The report wasn't available online. The report was archived, I was told when I called back, and could be requested through the Freedom of Information Act. I filed a FOIA request. I did it from home, using an online form, submitting a detailed request for all documents related to the grant, all interim reports, all correspondence between the NIH and county hospital, all records pertaining to the study population. Then I waited. Tuesday morning, I went to work like nothing was happening. Andrea was in the office. She looked worse than she had on Wednesday. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hair wasn't as carefully styled as usual. When she saw me, she looked away. I went to my desk and I tried to work on the routine death certificate filing. County births and deaths, marriages and divorces, normal life events that people reported to the government. The same work I'd been doing for 9 years before I'd known about room 227. My supervisor called me into her office at 10 a.m. "I need to talk to you about some concerns that have come up," she said. I knew what was coming. Someone had told her. Someone from the state health department, or the hospital, or somewhere in the institutional infrastructure. Someone had decided that I was a problem. "What kind of concerns?" I said. "Your access to the death certificate database. You've been pulling records that don't relate to your current assignments. Your supervisor notes indicate that you've been conducting personal research using county resources. That's a violation of our usage policy." "I was researching something related to my work," I said. "Michael, I need you to be honest with me. What are you looking for?" I could have lied. I could have said I was just curious about filing procedures. I could have said I was trying to understand how death certificates were processed during high-volume periods. But my supervisor, her name was Margaret, had been kind to me. She had never treated me as anything other than a competent professional, and I had crossed a line by using county resources for personal research, and she knew it, and I knew it. "I found something," I said, "in the death certificate database. Something that doesn't match. Multiple something. I'm trying to understand what happened." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to tell you something off the record. About 30 minutes ago, I received a phone call from someone in the state health department. They were asking questions about your access logs. They wanted to know if you'd been searching for any particular records. They wanted to know if you'd mentioned anything unusual to me." My stomach dropped. "I told them no," Margaret continued. "I told them you were a conscientious employee who did your job well, and that I had no concerns about your conduct. But Michael, if the state health department is calling me about your access to records, then something bigger is happening. And you need to understand that I can only protect you so much." "What did they ask about specifically?" I said. "They asked if you'd been looking at 1996 death certificates. They asked if you'd been interested in certificates from county hospital. They asked if you'd mentioned the psychiatric unit." Someone in the institutional infrastructure had flagged my searches. Someone was paying attention to what I was doing. Someone wanted to know what I knew. "I need to take the rest of the day off," I said. Margaret didn't argue. "Take the rest of the week. Take as much time as you need. But Michael, I want you to be careful. Whatever you're involved in, it's already big enough that people are paying attention. Don't make it bigger." I drove home. I parked in my usual spot. I took the stairs to my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Except it wasn't. The kitchen light was on. I always turned the kitchen light off before I left for work. The curtains in my bedroom were drawn differently. The stack of printed certificates I'd left on my kitchen table was still there, but the order had changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I would notice if I was paying careful attention. Someone had been inside my apartment. I called the police, not 911, the non-emergency line. I reported that my home had been entered and that items had been disturbed. A patrol officer came by and took a report. He looked at the kitchen table and the rearranged certificates and he said, "Are you sure someone was here? Could you have just moved things around and forgotten?" Yes, I could have. That was the point. Whoever had been in my apartment had been careful. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't destroyed anything. They'd just let me know that they could access my space whenever they wanted. The officer filed a report. He recommended that I change my locks, install a security system, be more careful about keeping my doors locked. Standard advice for a possible break-in that might not be a break-in at all. After he left, I sat on my couch, and I understood the reversal that Janet had been warning me about. The institution wasn't trying to keep me quiet. The institution wasn't trying to scare me into stopping my investigation. The institution already knew about my investigation. They'd known about it since I accessed the 1996 certificates from my work terminal. They'd known about it every time I searched the State Health Department database. They'd been tracking me the entire time. And they had let me continue. Because everything I'd found, they already knew I would find. Because the sealed records weren't actually sealed to me. They were sealed to the public. But I had access. I had credentials. I could pull whatever I wanted from the county system. And the institution was watching to see how much I would access, to see how much I would try to learn. They'd been monitoring me, and they'd decided that the best way to manage the situation was to let me investigate, to let me find pieces of the truth, to let me understand that I was being watched, and then to pressure me into silence through a combination of threat and inevitability. And it was working. Because now I understood that if I continued, if I pushed further, if I tried to expose what I'd found, the institution would respond. And the response wouldn't be limited to me. It would extend to anyone I involved. Andrea, Janet, my mother, anyone connected to me, anyone I told, anyone I trusted with what I knew. I called Janet. "Someone broke into my apartment," I said. "I know." "You know?" "Michael, I'm scared. I'm very scared. And I think you need to stop. I think you need to walk away from this right now." "Why?" "If the institution is monitoring me, if they're letting me investigate, that means they're afraid of something. It means there's more to this than just covering up what happened in the past. It means they're waiting to see what you do," Janet said. "And when you reach a certain point, when you've found enough that you might actually be able to prove something, they're going to move. And when they move, they're going to take everything. Your job, your freedom, your mother's safety, everything." How do you know that? Because that's what they did to everyone else who got close to the truth. That's how they've kept this quiet for 25 years. They don't silence you before you start investigating. They let you investigate. They let you find pieces. They watch to see if you're going to be a problem. And then, when they know, when they're sure you're going to push further, they eliminate you. Eliminate me? Professionally. Legally. They destroy your credibility. They make sure no one will believe what you say. They discredit you so thoroughly that even if you try to go public with what you've found, no one listens. I've seen them do it. I watched them do it to someone else years ago. Someone in the hospital who asked too many questions about what was happening in the sub-basement. What happened to them? They lost their job. They lost their home. They got arrested on charges that didn't stick, but that were enough to make them look unstable. They ended up isolated. They ended up broken. I understood then that I had passed a threshold. I had already found too much. I had already accessed documents that I shouldn't have accessed. I had already asked questions that the institution didn't want asked. And now the institution was deciding whether to let me continue my investigation until I became truly dangerous, or to shut me down now while I was still manageable. And the only reason they hadn't shut me down yet was because they were still learning something from watching me. They wanted to know how far I would go. They wanted to know what evidence I would try to gather. They wanted to know who I would tell. The phone call from the state health department to my supervisor suddenly made sense. They weren't calling to ask about me. They were calling to introduce themselves, to let Margaret know that they were paying attention, to begin the process of making me look unreliable. "What do I do?" I asked Janet. "You go back to work. You pretend you were just curious about historical filing procedures. You stop accessing the database. You stop investigating. You let them see that you've decided the cost of knowing is too high. And if I don't, then they destroy you, and they destroy me for helping you, and they destroy anyone else you've told. That's the cost of pushing further." I hung up. I sat in my apartment in the dark, and I understood that I had two choices. I could walk away. I could go back to my ordinary job and my ordinary life, carrying the knowledge of what had happened in room 227 and what had been done to that child and to the other children. I could live with the fact that I knew the truth and that I had chosen silence. Or I could push further. I could risk everything. I could contact the journalist whose name Janet had mentioned. I could provide evidence of what happened. I could try to force the institution to acknowledge what they'd done, but I would do it, knowing that the cost would be catastrophic. Not just to me, but to everyone around me. And that was when I realized the truly horrifying part of what the institution had done. They had constructed a system where the truth was accessible to me, but where telling the truth would destroy innocent people. They had created a situation where speaking out became morally impossible, because the consequences would be borne by people who hadn't done anything wrong. That was how they had kept the secret for 25 years. Not by hiding it, by making it cost too much to expose it. I went back to work on Wednesday. I filed death certificates. I answered phones. I participated in a staff meeting about updating our filing procedures. I did everything I could to appear normal, to appear unconcerned, to appear like someone who had decided to let the investigation go. But I was still thinking. I was still planning. And I was still receiving information. The FOIA request response arrived on Thursday. Not the complete report. That would take longer to process. But a preliminary response acknowledging that the request had been received and that documents were being compiled. One document was available immediately. The grant application from 1994. I read the grant application. It was written in the careful language of scientific research. The study aimed to identify early markers of psychiatric illness in children with the goal of developing preventive intervention protocols. The study population would be recruited from voluntary referrals, with parental consent obtained through standard informed consent procedures. Voluntary referrals, parental consent, standard procedures. All the language that made the program sound legitimate, sound ethical, sound like normal medical research. But I knew now that the children in the program hadn't been there voluntarily. They'd been there because they were already vulnerable. Children from families on public assistance. Children whose parents couldn't read the consent forms. Children who had no one protecting them. And one of those children had been my father's own son, Daniel Marcus Hendricks, age 5 when he was admitted, dead by October 1996. I started searching for Daniel's mother. If there was a custody arrangement, there would be court records. If there was child support, there would be payment records. If Daniel existed in any official capacity, there would be a trail. I found a court filing from 1991. Thomas David Hendricks and Michelle Reeves regarding custody of minor child Daniel Marcus Hendricks. The filing indicated that Michelle Reeves had primary custody and that Thomas Hendricks was obligated to pay $150 per month in child support. Michelle Reeves, Janet Reeves. Could they be related? The last name was uncommon enough that it might not be a coincidence. I called Janet. "Is Michelle Reeves your sister?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Yes." "Did she have a son named Daniel?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes." "And he died in 1996. "Yes. He died in October 1996. He was in the psychiatric program at County Hospital. He had a reaction to one of the medications they were giving him. He had a seizure, and he didn't recover from it." "Your sister knew about the program?" "My sister didn't know what the program actually was. She thought it was a voluntary psychiatric evaluation. She thought it was treatment. Thomas told her it would help Daniel. Thomas said Daniel was showing signs of behavioral problems, and that early intervention could prevent serious psychiatric illness later in life. He convinced her to sign the consent forms. And then Daniel was admitted. And then Daniel died. And then the hospital filed a death certificate using a false name." "My name," I said. "Yes, your name. Your father chose to use your name to cover up the death of his own child. That's what kind of man your father was, Michael. That's what he was capable of. Why didn't your sister expose it? Why didn't she go public?" "Because the hospital told her that the program was classified. Because they told her that revealing what happened to Daniel would put national security at risk. Because they told her that the program was part of a government research initiative and that discussing it was illegal. Because she was a single mother making minimum wage, and she didn't have the resources to fight the federal government. Because she was afraid." I understood then why Janet had taken the job in the county records office. She'd been looking for a way to understand what had happened to her nephew. She'd been trying to find evidence of the crime without being able to expose it. "Where is your sister now?" I asked. "She died in 2003. Cancer. She never recovered from what happened to Daniel. She spent years trying to find proof, trying to find evidence, trying to figure out how to bring charges against the people responsible, and it destroyed her." Janet's voice had changed. It was harder now, more certain. "So, when you came asking about that death certificate, when you started investigating, I knew what was going to happen to you. I knew that you would keep digging, because you're your father's son, and he was the kind of man who could convince himself that horrible things were necessary. And I knew that the institution would let you dig until you got close enough to be dangerous. And then they would destroy you the same way they destroyed my sister. Why did you help me then?" "Because Michelle deserved to have someone acknowledge what happened to her son. Because Daniel deserved to have his real name restored. Because your father spent 30 years walking around the world while his own child was declared officially dead under a false identity. And because I thought maybe you were different from your father. I thought maybe you would have the courage to do what Michelle couldn't do." I realized then that Janet had been testing me. She had given me pieces of the truth, watching to see if I would continue investigating, watching to see if I would be willing to sacrifice everything to expose what had happened. And I had continued. And now the institution was watching, waiting to see if I would become a problem that needed to be dealt with. "The institution knows I know," I said. "They've been in my apartment. They've called my supervisor. They're going to move against me soon." "Yes," Janet said. "They are." "What do I do?" "That depends on what you're willing to lose." After I hung up, I sat at my desk, and I pulled the death certificates I'd printed. 11 children. 11 deaths filed during the time the program was operating. One of them was Daniel Marcus Hendricks, my father's son, buried under my name so that his death could be forgotten. I could walk away. I could pretend I'd never found any of this. I could let the institution manage me, discredit me, destroy me in a slow, careful way that wouldn't raise questions. I could let Daniel remain officially dead under my name. Or I could tell someone. I could contact the journalist. I could provide evidence. I could force the institution to acknowledge what they'd done. But if I did that, my mother would suffer. She would be implicated by association. She would be questioned. She would be investigated. Her life would be disrupted in ways I couldn't predict or control. And Andrea would suffer. She had helped me, and her help would become evidence of her own complicity. She would lose her job. Her career would be destroyed. And Janet would suffer. She had told me the truth, and the truth would be traced back to her. I had created a situation where the only way to expose the crime was to destroy the people I cared about. But here was the thing I realized as I sat at my desk, looking at the 11 death certificates. The institution had created that situation deliberately. They had made it so that exposing what happened would cost too much, so that moral people would choose silence. They had designed a system where telling the truth was impossible. And the only way to break that system was to accept the cost, to stop trying to protect the people I cared about, and instead expose what had happened, understanding that they would suffer consequences, but understanding also that if I didn't, if I stayed silent, they would suffer consequences anyway. The consequence of living in a world where such crimes were hidden, where institutions could experiment on children and erase them from existence. I made my decision. I called the journalist whose name Janet had given me. I asked for a meeting. The journalist agreed to meet me Friday evening at a coffee shop across the state border in Ohio, somewhere far enough from Indianapolis that the institution wouldn't immediately know what was happening. Then I wrote a letter to Andrea, explaining what I had found and why I had involved her. I wrote a letter to my mother, explaining what my father had done and what I was about to do about it. I wrote a letter to Janet thanking her for her honesty and apologizing for the consequences that would come to her. I didn't send the letters. Not yet. I would send them Friday, after I'd met with the journalist, after I'd handed over the evidence, after the institution began to move against me. Thursday evening, I received a call from someone at the State Health Department. Not Patricia Voss. A woman I didn't recognize, speaking in the careful, professional voice of someone trained in institutional management. "Michael, we need to talk about your recent activities," she said. "What activities?" "Your FOIA request, your searches through the death certificate database, your investigation into historical records. We're concerned about your understanding of your role and your responsibilities as a county employee." "I was conducting research related to my work," I said. "No, you weren't. You were conducting a personal investigation into classified historical records, and we need to understand why. We need to understand what you're planning to do with the information you've gathered." "I'm not planning anything," I said. "I don't believe you. I think you're planning to contact a journalist. I think you're planning to make public information that was classified for legitimate national security reasons. And I need to advise you that doing so would be a federal crime. Disclosure of classified information is prosecuted very seriously. You could face 20 years in prison." "The information isn't classified," I said. "It's just sealed." "It's sealed because it involves a federal research program. That makes it classified, regardless of how it's labeled. And if you try to release it, we will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. "I understand." "Good. Then you'll understand that cooperating with us is in your best interest. If you provide us with everything you've gathered, if you destroy all copies of the documents you've accessed, if you agree to never discuss this matter again, we can arrange for this investigation to be resolved quietly. You can keep your job. You can continue your life. This doesn't have to be a disaster." "And if I don't cooperate?" I asked. "Then we'll prosecute you for unauthorized access to federal records. We'll notify your employer that you're under federal investigation. We'll make sure that no one in any government agency will ever hire you again. We'll put you in a position where you'll be unemployable and discredited, and then you'll have 20 years in prison to think about whether it was worth it. I thought about Janet's sister. I thought about how the institution had convinced her not to speak up. I thought about the system they designed to make speaking impossible. I need time to think about it, I said. You have until Monday. After that, we move forward with the prosecution. I hung up. I sat in my apartment, and I understood that I had now reached the point Janet had warned me about. The point where the institution was done watching and was moving to contain me. I had 3 days to decide whether to accept their offer or to go forward with the journalist. If I accepted, I would survive. I would keep my job. I would keep my life. But I would be complicit in the cover-up. I would be choosing to let Daniel Marcus Hendricks remain officially dead under my name. I would be choosing to let the institution continue to hide what they'd done. If I went forward, I would lose everything. But I would force the truth into the world. I would force the institution to acknowledge what they'd done. I would force them to answer for it. Friday evening arrived. I drove to Ohio. I sat across from a journalist named Sarah Chen at a coffee shop in a small town near the state border. I handed her a folder containing photographs of the death certificates, copies of the grant application, the newspaper articles, the academic publication. This is going to be a big story, Sarah said. But I need you to understand what happens next. Once this goes public, once this becomes news, the institution is going to respond. They're going to try to discredit you. They're going to try to discredit the story. They're going to make your life very difficult. I know, I said. Are you sure? Because after this conversation, there's no going back. I'm sure. I drove back to Indianapolis at midnight. I mailed the letters I'd written. Then I waited to see what the institution would do when they realized I'd chosen to speak instead of staying silent. The story broke on Sunday morning. Sarah Chen's article ran on the front page of the Indianapolis Star. Federal program experimented on psychiatric patients without proper consent. She had written it carefully, using the documents I'd provided, corroborating details through interviews with archived researchers, hospital records, and institutional observers. She had included the names: Patricia Voss, Richard Massey, Thomas Hendricks, County Hospital. The program ran from 1994 to 1997. Estimated 47 children enrolled. Multiple adverse reactions documented. At least 4 confirmed deaths. Records sealed by federal order in 1996. The article included a photograph of the death certificate for Daniel Marcus Hendricks, filed in October 1996, with a notation explaining that the child had died during experimental psychiatric treatment. The article mentioned that a second identity, mine, had been used to file a false death certificate as part of the cover-up. By noon, my phone had stopped working from the volume of calls. By 2 p.m., reporters were outside my apartment building. By 6 p.m., the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By midnight, it had become a federal investigation. The institution moved fast. On Monday morning, federal agents arrived at my apartment with a warrant. They seized my laptop, my external hard drives, my phone. They arrested me on charges of unauthorized access to federal records and theft of classified information. They read me my rights. They took me to a federal detention facility. The charges were serious. The maximum sentence was 20 years. But Sarah's article had already made it clear that I had acted as a whistleblower. Public opinion, at least initially, was in my favor. The institution couldn't simply disappear me without it looking like retaliation. My attorney negotiated. The charges were eventually reduced. I pleaded guilty to unauthorized access, a misdemeanor. In exchange, I agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. The federal prosecutor announced that my cooperation had been instrumental in bringing charges against Patricia Voss and 2 other state health department officials. The program had been illegal. The experiments had violated federal regulations. The cover-up had constituted obstruction of justice. But I understood what was really happening. The institution was allowing me to cooperate. They were allowing me to testify. They were allowing the lower-level officials to be prosecuted, because doing so contained the damage. Because prosecuting Patricia Voss and the hospital administrators was easier than defending what they had done. Because sacrificing some people was the price of keeping the larger system intact. The federal government acknowledged that the program had violated regulations. The government apologized to the families of the children involved. The government established a fund to compensate the families. But the government did not prosecute the NIH officials who had approved the grant. The government did not prosecute the federal researchers who had designed the program. The government did not acknowledge that the cover-up had been systematic, coordinated, and protected by federal authority. The institution had adapted. They had accepted the scandal, compartmentalized it, and moved forward. My mother survived the exposure. Her employer was uncomfortable with the publicity, but they didn't fire her. She moved to a different branch of the company in a different state, but she kept her job. She called me once while I was awaiting sentencing, and she said, "I'm proud of you, and I'm angry at you, and I don't know how to hold both of those things at the same time." I understood. I had destroyed her sense of safety. I had forced her to acknowledge what her ex-partner had done. I had made her complicit in a crime by association, and I had forced the world to pay attention to something she had spent 30 years trying to forget. Andrea kept her job, but her professional reputation was damaged. Her connection to the records I'd accessed, her help in giving me information, her failure to immediately report my investigation, all of it became known. Her supervisor changed. Her responsibilities were reduced. She went from being a respected administrator to being someone people whispered about in the break room. She eventually took early retirement. We never spoke again after the investigation began. Janet gave testimony at the trial. She described the program in detail. She described the procedures. She described the medications. She described watching children suffer complications. She described the institutional response, the denial, the cover-up, the systematic erasure of what had happened. Janet's testimony was emotional. People in the courtroom cried. Her words made it impossible to deny that what had happened was real, that children had actually suffered, that the institution had knowingly hidden it. But Janet paid a price for that testimony. She couldn't work in medical fields anymore. No hospital would hire her. She became a target for the institutional loyalists, for the people who saw her as a traitor, for the people who blamed her for dragging the program into public view. She eventually moved to Vermont and opened a small bookstore. She lived quietly. She moved forward. Michelle Reeves's name was restored. Daniel Marcus Hendricks was no longer officially dead under my identity. He was officially dead under his own name, with his own death certificate, with his own story. It didn't bring him back. It didn't undo what had happened to him. But it restored his existence. It made him a person again, not just an erased child, not just a bureaucratic notation. My sentencing was in December, 9 months after the article broke. The federal judge acknowledged my cooperation. The judge acknowledged that I had acted in the public interest. The judge sentenced me to time served, the 2 weeks I'd spent in federal detention, plus 5 years probation. I was unemployable in government. No county would hire me. No state agency would hire me. No federal institution would hire me. I was a whistleblower, which meant I was someone who had broken institutional loyalty. I was someone who had chosen public truth over institutional protection. I took a job at a printing company. The pay was half what I'd made in county records. The work was mindless, but it was work. It kept me functional. For the first year after the story broke, I lived in a small apartment in a different neighborhood. I stayed away from places where I might run into people who knew my history. I didn't try to explain myself. I tried to make myself small and forgettable. But I couldn't stop thinking about the moment when the man in the basement of the state health department had asked me to choose, when he had told me that some truths are too dangerous to speak, when he had offered me a way out, a path that would have allowed me to survive, to keep my job, to keep my life. I had refused, and in refusing, I had made a choice that was ultimately selfish, because it was based on my own need to tell the truth, not on any calculation of actual benefit. The truth about the program was now public, yes. The institution had been held accountable, yes. But that accountability was limited. The people responsible for designing the program had retired comfortably. The people who had approved the program at the federal level had kept their jobs. The system that had allowed such a program to exist in the first place, the system of compartmentalization, of sealed records, of institutional protection, that system remained intact. And the cost of my refusal to stay silent had been paid by people I cared about. My mother had been forced to confront her ex-partner's crimes. Andrea had lost her career trajectory. Janet had lost her ability to work in the field she'd chosen. And for what? For a story that was in the newspaper for 3 weeks before being replaced by other news? For a scandal that the institution had managed and contained? I had been naive to think that speaking truth would lead to justice. I had been naive to think that exposing a crime would result in meaningful change. The institution was larger than any individual truth. The institution was flexible enough to absorb even major scandals and continue operating. 2 years after the article broke, I received a letter. It was from Michelle Reeves, Janet's sister's estate, forwarded through Janet. The letter explained that Michelle had set aside funds in her will for research into psychiatric trauma and institutional abuse. The letter named me as one of the trustees of those funds. Michelle had wanted the money to be used to help other families whose children had been harmed by institutional programs. I had never met Michelle. She had died before the article, before the investigation, before any of this became public. But she had believed that someone would eventually expose what had happened to Daniel. She had believed that there would be someone willing to speak the truth, no matter the cost. And she had prepared, in her own way, to use that truth for something. So there was a small redemption. Not a restoration, not a reversal, but a channel for the damage I had caused. A way to transform the cost into something that might help other people. I accepted the position as trustee. I helped establish a foundation that provided legal support to families filing claims against government institutions. I helped pay for investigations into other programs that might have caused harm. I helped ensure that the truth about one program led, however slowly, to greater scrutiny of other programs. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. 3 years after the article, I ran into Andrea at a grocery store. She was older looking than I remembered. Her hair was completely gray now. She was shopping for one person. No partner. No family visible. We made eye contact across the produce section. For a moment, I thought she might turn away, as she had before. But instead, she walked toward me. "I got the job," she said. "The one I wanted before. Different agency. Different state. It took a year of applications, but I got it. That's good, I said. That's really good. I wanted you to know that I didn't blame you. Not anymore. I understand why you did what you did. And I understand that what happened to me was the price of that choice. I've made peace with it. She walked away before I could respond. I thought about that conversation for months. I thought about the generosity it took for Andrea to tell me she'd made peace with the damage I'd caused. I thought about how that generosity was something she didn't owe me. I thought about how I had never asked her for forgiveness and didn't deserve it. My mother and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. We talked on the phone every week. We saw each other twice a year. We didn't talk about Thomas or the hospital or the program. We talked about her life in Missouri, my life in Indianapolis, ordinary things. The wound was still there, but it had scarred over. It was part of the landscape of our relationship now, something we had survived together. 5 years after the article, I was no longer on probation. The case was closed. The institution had been reformed. New oversight structures had been put in place, new review processes, new transparency requirements. Patricia Voss had spent 2 years in prison. Richard Massey had died of a heart attack before trial. The hospital had closed its sub-basement psychiatric unit permanently. But I understood that these changes were surface level. The institution would continue. Other programs would be created. Other children would be at risk. The system was too large, too entrenched, too protected by federal authority to be truly changed by one scandal. I had exposed a truth. I had chosen to speak instead of staying silent. I had accepted the cost of that choice, and the cost had been significant. For me, for my mother, for Andrea, for Janet. We had all paid the price of my refusal to accept the institution's offer. And sometimes, I wondered if the man in the basement had been right. If some truths are so dangerous that the cost of speaking them outweighs the benefit. If there are circumstances where silence is actually the moral choice, where protecting the people you love is more important than exposing what the institution has done. But then I would think about Daniel Marcus Hendricks. I would think about a 5-year-old child who died in a hospital while his own father watched, while his own father helped cover it up, while his own father allowed the child's identity to be erased and replaced with another child's name. And I would understand that staying silent would have been its own form of betrayal. That accepting the institution's offer would have been choosing comfort over the truth. That living quietly, while knowing what had been done, would have been complicit in the crime. So I had made the right choice, even though it had cost people I loved, even though it had changed the course of my life in ways I didn't want. Even though the institutional response had been limited and managed and contained. I had spoken. I had refused the offer. I had chosen truth over protection. And I lived with the consequences.